Dr. Patrick, interestingly speaking, that before Nancy Pelosi announced her trip to Asia, including the region of Taiwan, that mix of messages were sent out from the White House. So in other words, on one hand, again, as we mentioned in the intro or before taping the interview, that we said a few higher officials try to stop Nancy from visiting Taiwan because they clearly understood that by visiting Taiwan, and this is not the prime moment, and this is not the prime time for her to take such actions. But on the other hand, remember, there are still some hardcore Republicans and Democrats who actually take bold stand on behalf of Taiwan to be against China, given many issues, for example, the territorial dispute, human rights abuse, technology or technological theft, putting everything together. But again, as you mentioned before, recently the Chinese leader Xi Jinping and sitting US President Joe Biden just had the 5th virtue meeting. And again, we didn't really understand a lot more content were being discussed within this meeting, but on the general sense, it was about diplomatic relations and it was about trade relationship, those common mutual economic prosperity. So again, my next question to you, Dr. Patrick, is how would you evaluate or how should we assess the relationship between China and the US at this moment? Because significantly speaking, this year, 2022, has been so difficult and so challenging for both leaders. And why do you think it's so important that we need to address these bilateral ties? And meanwhile, don't you think this Nancy Pelosi's trip to Asia that indicates some sort of internal fracture within this Democratic Party? Help us understand, Dr. Patrick.
Well, if you have 2 Democrats in a room, there's 3 different opinions about what should be done. They disagree just to disagree with each other often. That's one of the reasons they have been, one of many reasons they've been ineffective, even though they control the House, the Senate, and the White House. But I think the next actual concrete thing you'll see is a meeting between Biden and Xi coming up in a meeting. I think it's in Indonesia coming up before long. It's just around the corner.
That's right.
And I think that'll move forward. And probably by that time, we'll also have seen, or near that time, we will see the trade sanctions tariffs lifted, which will definitely be a positive piece of news for both China and the United States, and from the view of many people who support lifting those tariffs. Not all do, but it certainly plays to Biden's short-term goal if it does give a bump in Biden's favor in lowering inflation. So I don't see this as being a lasting issue. I think certainly the disagreements that exist around the world over the issues of Taiwan are clear. I don't think those are going away anytime soon. But here's something I spotted in listening to the headlines flying on this, kind of like you got to watch when you're watching a musician. They're often, a magician. They're doing their tricks right in front of you, so you just have to watch carefully. But the whole thing that came up about whether or not Biden said that he had brought up human rights and the Uyghur situation. China's foreign minister said, no, that's disinformation. That did not come up. Well, now, yes, both sides put out their own kind of summary view that's usually fairly vague out of the White House as to what was talked about in the conversation. But there are transcripts somewhere to discuss whether or not this actually took place. And with the frequency with which Biden lies to the American people on a regular basis here, people are saying, this could be either side kind of spinning the story here about whether it was even discussed. The implication being that it probably, if it was brought up in kind of an oblique or from an angle, there really wasn't any kind of significant conversation. But Biden is likely to say they did have a conversation, all in a very unspecific way, because he didn't provide any details, that it makes you wonder that if Biden was simply playing to certain, again, domestic audiences from a political point of view, because this is an issue that resonates with a lot of his base. And so he had to say something, but doesn't mean that it was brought up. In fact, both of them may have very valid opinions of saying that, no, we really didn't discuss it, even if it was mentioned in a passing way. So I found that very fascinating. Again, Biden is playing to a domestic audience with an election right around the corner that affects a lot of Democrats, particularly, who very likely will lose their jobs in November. And that's a whole nother issue, but as to what's happening with the elections. But that's, I think, I found that very fascinating and amusing that China said, no, wait, he did not bring it up. Okay. And I thought that just made me smile, because, you know, Biden has a habit of kind of saying things and then having to figure out, well, how do we unsay them? And who knows? We'll see.
Dr. Patrick, let me be devil's advocate for the next question, because we know that China is a rising power. And not only, again, as you mentioned before, in November, that both Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, and also the leader of South Korea, Japan, you know, some of the critical countries in Asia, they are going to meet in Indonesia to attend this upcoming G20 summit. And I think that's part of the reason why recently the Indonesian president, he wrapped up his trip. As a matter of fact, he started his journey, first leg was actually in Beijing, and then he wrapped up his journey in South Korea, again, for the preparation of the G20 summit. But let me ask the question, how much do you think the world, specifically regarding the countries in Southeast Asia, including the U.S., can trust China at this moment? Because we know that based on the reports and based on the reality, recently that China's zero COVID policy failed, and this economic slowness stunned the world. And meanwhile, you know, there are a lot more critical issues that Xi Jinping has to deal with before this congressional meeting or this party get together very soon. So I want to ask you, how much can the world trust China and also the leader of China today in order to further or to enhance the collaboration effectively?
Well, I think that I would be surprised if a simple incident led him to make a major decision like a Nancy Pelosi situation. I think not that they might have, I think they would have genuinely corralled her in some measure if that happened. But I frankly don't think, I think that was all part of a game being played for other purposes. But I find China's president to be a very calculated, planning sort of individual. He knows what he's going to do. He knows when he's going to do it. I think he's a lot more measured and that way reliable based on who he is and what he thinks than, say, Russia. Russia pumps out the propaganda. They all do. All countries are loaded with propaganda. But I think Russia's the more unstable, Putin's the more unstable of the leaders, well, in a direct way. So I think that as it regards Taiwan, I don't anticipate seeing something erratic on the basis of China. They say what they're going to do, they do it. And you know, that takes two sides to make that work. But I'm not expecting him to as it were, pull a stunt, although that's quite possible. And I said, if you recall, I said so at the time of before the Olympics, that after the Olympics are done, this was a time when they see Joe Biden as being a weak president, and that creates an opportunity and a window for others to make their moves, which of course we saw Putin do, and that's even a more volatile situation at the moment. So we'll see. I don't think we can second guess him on that. I'll be very interested to see what happens at the in some of the events coming up. I do think there's a real possibility for Biden and Xi to get together in Indonesia. I think that's far more likely than anything going on any further regarding Nancy Pelosi.
Now, Dr. Patrick, I got one more question before we move on to domestic affairs. Recently, I'm sure that not too long ago, you also read the news that former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was sadly and tragically assassinated. Now, this such news astonished the entire international community because we know that Abe created such a legacy not only with the country of US, but also he generated a lot more economic partnerships, for example, with countries in Africa. And also remember under Abe that the Quad relationship was built or was solidified, you know, with the US, with Australia, Japan, you know, India, all those crucial countries. But fast forward, Joe Biden just recently wrapped up another trip in the Middle East, and also he created another group. That's what they called Middle East Quad. You know, include Israel, and also the UAE, and also India and US as well. So my next question to you is, by the standard or by the effort from the US side that putting more Asian strategic countries involved in different levels or in different categories or, you know, whatever you want to call it, organizations or committees, how would you think that China should react to the Quad relationship, to the I2U2, and also to the Joe Biden's recent trip in the Middle East? So in other words, do you think that China should be so anxious and concerned about the US presence and also elaboration with those allies and partners? What do you think, Dr. Patrick?
Well, I think President Xi is about ready to get another 5 years, which I don't think anybody thinks otherwise. Joe Biden is already considered, I mean, if you look at the polls, he's at 38%, the lowest of any modern president. And there were times when people thought that Richard Nixon should be removed from office, and he was at about 38%. Biden's pretty well done as anything as an effective president. He's the lame of the lamest at this point from a historic point of view. He's got 2 years max left running for office again, as is really just kind of a circus discussion, because it really isn't happening. So there's nothing there really, I think, for President Xi to think about. He's got his own plans. He's making progress. I think that both sides, all sides, are going to be very have their hands full, as it were, dealing with food shortages, with energy shortages. These are not temporary issues. Climate change. I'm surprised China waited as long as it did to begin to ramp back some of its controls on that were the early controls involving COVID. The science is overwhelming about the limitations of masks, overwhelming about the effectiveness of lockdown. These issues, which people who brought them up at first were considered, you know, following tinfoil conspiracy theories. The fact is, the science was well established. Science hasn't changed. People didn't want a lot of the science out there. And they're finding right now that the science is clearly that those old methods aren't functional anymore. Now, I'm not saying that China didn't have reasons to do what they were doing. I'm not questioning that. But I am saying that it's time to move on. And I think China's got some very clear directions of what it's doing with Belt and Road, and I think it's going to continue to follow its organized, thought-through path. And what Biden does, I don't think is going to prove to be significant beyond, of course, lifting some of those trade restrictions and tariffs until the next president. So the next president, it becomes an issue. But right now, any kind of organization of nations is really they're all going to have their hands full. They're going to have their hands full with energy, with food, and many other kinds of. Look at what happened with just weather across much of the world, with all kinds of natural disasters and fires and other things. So everybody's got stuff to do, and I don't think it's anything for Xi at this point to be concerned about in terms of what other countries out there are doing, but to the kind of steady state moving forward with his plans. And he's established himself deeply in a variety of countries, including Africa. I think watching Africa is going to be fascinating because China has great inroads in China, and great inroads. Yes, they do. Great inroads in Africa. Because Africa's in trouble and is going to be hit the hardest from food shortages and things like that. So,
Dr. Patrick, let's move on to some of the issues regarding our domestic affairs. As you mentioned before, right now, at this moment as we're speaking, that everyone is following and also is paying attention to this upcoming midterm election in November. It's very crucial for the Democrats, but meanwhile, the Republicans are not sitting on the bench and just watching how the Democrats are continue to react and also to readapt themselves into these upcoming challenges. But there are some contenders who are very much interested in the 2024 presidential run. For example, Pete Buttigieg, the well-known what's that called? The well-known mayor. And also we've seen Cory Booker, again, last time he was trying to compete with Joe Biden, with other, famous icons as well. But meanwhile, people are right now within this Democrat Party are pushing some of the extreme progressives. For example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, again, so at this moment, Dr. Patrick, I don't want to ask you who you think will be the next competitor for the 2024, but help us to understand the simple question is, how much room do you think the Democrats have today in order to build or continue the political reputation? Again, we are looking at this crossroads. Will the table turn again to Republican? If so, how many winning tickets can the Republican actually compete with the Democrats at this moment?
Well, this is a fascinating, for all the elections I've covered over many years, this one was the most fascinating and for a time puzzling one for me, because here you had a party in the Democrats who ostensibly, whether you believe it or not, had a majority vote in the presidential race. They controlled the House, they controlled the Senate, they controlled the White House, and you would have expected them to govern in the middle and capture enough support from basic American values and direction to have solidified their role for 20 years. To be very strong, because they could have passed all sorts of legislation by pulling together. But we're watching, and I've brought that up. I said, why did the Democrats implode the way they have? I mean, inflation has gotten crazy, and we can talk about that as a different issue, but they let the borders just collapse, and the huge drug imports into the U.S. With all sorts of cartels that are operating on sex slave trade. And I mean, the amount of problems with public schools, putting at the very forefront issues on on sexual choice. So I'm sitting there watching a Supreme Court candidate woman say they couldn't answer the question, what is a woman? I mean, you had all kinds of dynamics that are true to form for a lot of Democratic points of view. But if they could pull a bad card out of the deck, they kept doing it and alienated, I think, a great deal of the average American electorate. The guy who's, whether you call him a Republican or a Democrat, he gets up in the morning, he goes to work, he comes home, he wants to have his paycheck, take care of his family, and they alienated all of these people through all kinds of choices that they were made. And there are at least 6 or 7 critical issues, and starting with inflation, that will be dead center at the come election time. You can get a lot of issues wrong or right out there, and a lot of them are border issues like abortion, but those aren't the ones that decide elections. Get into the pocketbook of a working class American family, and that decides elections. And the history of that is long. Wonderful people like, Jimmy Carter were in trouble over, elections. I mean, over the financial conditions. So, and lost elections. So the issue is clear, is I think it's fairly undeniable that the Democrats have blown that they're muffed their opportunity by not governing to the middle. And even when it became apparent that they were losing, they didn't shift and govern to the middle. They kept putting out the most extreme kinds of positions and basically running to their own base, but their base has collapsed. Hispanics have moved dramatically to see what the Republicans have to offer. They've been losing larger and larger numbers of black leaders. The Democrats are in trouble, and it may take a long time for them to get it back. Having said that, the party's going to switch dramatically, and the power of controlling Congress is going to change. So that if anybody had any doubts about Biden being fairly well retired as a president in the next 2 years, that's a foregone conclusion, I think. That's not really up for any kind of number counts. And the Democrats would tell you the same thing. There's no way they can count it. So why they gave it away, it's a bit of a mystery. I've been actually formulating ideas about why they continued to do what they're doing. But they thought they could collapse the system, and they just weren't able to get the things through on the most radical points that they thought they could. We'll see what happens, but I think now the question is, can the Republicans govern? And it depends on who they go for in 2024. You mentioned Trump. You watch Trump, and I actually have to chuckle when I watch him talk, because he hasn't changed. The same stuff comes out of his mouth. That's right. He's really strong on certain issues, but you're going, good heavens, guy. I mean, can you just he is a strong dose of whatever it is whatever medicine he may be. He's a very strong dose. So I guess I'm a little more reluctant to believe that Trump will even be on the ticket at this point. But he may be on the ticket. I don't think they're going to slow him down when it comes to getting to the conventions. But ultimately, is he going to be the candidate, or are they going to get someone who they feel is... Americans are tired, really, of having a circus in the White House. And I think that with all of the kind of oddball stuff that's happened, but they're very unhappy with what's happened. And a lot of Democrats are apologetic. I mean, rank and file working class Democrats are, they're just, they look at what's happened and they can't believe it, but neither can a lot of other people. So,
Dr. Patrick, I want to wrap up our conversation with one last critical question. We've seen and also we've read an answer from the surveys, and very often during this political or election season, one of the questions plays a significant role, which is do you think America is on the right track? Whether that means politically or economically or culturally. And of course, that based on the recent answer, if I'm not mistaken, more than 43% of Americans who participated in the survey believe America is not on the right course. You know, again, politically or economically speaking. So I want to ask the same question to you, because you always answer the question with a deeper analysis and also with insightful, how can I say, approaches. So, Dr. Patrick, how would you think the world today sees the role of America? You know, again, back in the days, we always believed that, you know, to quote Ronald Reagan's saying that U.S. was supposed to be the beacon on the hill, or also to be the light of the darkness, to be the example of democracy. You know, the capitalistic system demonstrates the freedom. So, I mean, the list can go on and on and on. But today, putting everything together, do you think the country is still on the right track? And how do you think the rest of the world sees what's happening in America today, particularly related to all the cultural wars, the political disentanglement, and also this economic crisis? And what do you...
Well, you know, when we stand back and look at what the outcomes of what we're seeing in the United States, some people, if you ask them, are we on the right track? They would be thinking on the right track to what we used to be. I really don't think we're going to see that emerge. I don't think we're going back to something we once might have been. I think the changes and the brokenness and the chaos is too deep and too broad to expect it to return to normal, as it were, from some years ago. There's too much water under that bridge. I do think that there's a chance for it to be constructive and for the United States to play a significant role, perhaps a more limited leadership role, but to play a significant impact and role in the world situations that we're facing going forward. How it does that, I don't think it's going to be a issue that one party can solve or another. It's going to take parties working together, which we do not have. We have a country that is, I think, irreparably damaged, and it's going to take generations. We need to speak in generations to see the level of broad cooperation. Now, there's people that want to gravitate and talk about the Great Reset and all of that, and I think that's wishful thinking by some people at the international level. But they're using a lot of power and a lot of people and a lot of propaganda to try and capture the flag, as it were, themselves. I think it's the United States is going to make changes, but I still think that there's some chances for the United States to play a strong leadership role and become a harbinger, as it were, of the kind of freedom that most of the world is looking for. So I still think that's possible. One election, one politician's not going to do it. It's going to take a breadth of people who may disagree, but who rejoin a system that is trying to make that happen in a cohesive and coherent way. And right now, we got to get some lights on in the room, because the lights have been blown out. And we need a lot more lights on than we've got right now. We'll see. We'll see if we start with the next election a rebuild, but it's looking as grim, as it were, as it could be for the moment. I think this is why China is continuing to grow. This is why China has, yes, it's got some very significant problems with finances, with all sorts of other trade and a lot of things going on. But it has its own story to tell. And the United States has one as well. We'll see what takes place in the next election, and whether or not somebody figures it out that where we're going, where we want to go, you can't get there from here. We're going to have to do some things different.